Hey everyone, Emily here and welcome to my kitchen. I have a ton of tomatoes coming out of my garden right now, and one of my favorite things to do is to cook with fresh tomatoes and find a way to use them up before I have to start either freezing them or canning them. They're just so good fresh. One of my favorite things to make with tomatoes is bruschetta, and I think it would be really good added into a grilled cheese with some mozzarella and some parmesan. So let's give this a try and see how it comes out. This is a super simple recipe overall, and of course the base is going to be some really good tomatoes out of my garden. I'm gonna use one large tomato. You could use a couple smaller ones. This one, you'll notice, does have several splits in it. I didn't pick these soon enough and we had a really heavy round of rain and the tomatoes just ended up splitting. In general, these are just fine to use. You'll just want to kind of cut around all of these splits as you're cutting the tomato, and it's gonna be just fine to use. So I'm gonna start by cutting out several chunks from the tomato, and we'll just keep chopping this up. And a good trick to use a serrated knife. Using a bread knife kind of helps you cut into the tomato a little bit easier. So if you tend to struggle cutting really nice slices out of your tomato, which it really doesn't matter when you're making bruschetta, but if that's something you struggle with in general, using a serrated knife is really going to help you get kind of a cleaner cut. All right, I have cut around all of these cracks here, and so now I'm just gonna cut off the remaining bottom portion of the tomato. And I have a really good amount of super juicy, fresh, ripe tomato here, and I can just toss this little top with all the splits and it's gonna be just fine. I'll just continue chopping this up. I have some heirloom tomatoes in my garden. That's what I'm using right now. I also have some San Marzano tomatoes. You can use whatever you prefer, but these ones just looked really good to me right now. I'm gonna cut these up into fairly small pieces. Does not have to be perfect. We're just gonna be mixing this up anyway. This is so juicy. Now that my tomato is all cut up, I'm just going to go ahead and transfer it into a bowl. There is quite a bit of juice here, so I'm not gonna scrape it right into the bowl. I'm going to leave as much of the juice behind on the cutting board as I can, and then kind of clean that up before I start chopping the rest of my ingredients. Next, I'm going to throw in a good amount of basil. I have a huge container that I need to use up that I bought for another recipe last week. So I'm just going to pull off a good amount of leaves and then give this a chop up and add it right into my tomatoes. These leaves are pretty tiny, so I'm going to do my best to stack these on top of each other and kind of roll it up. This is not going to be perfect because they're so small, but you'll get these nice little ribbons when you cut across there. And if you don't have fresh basil at home, but you have dried basil, I really would recommend going out and buying some fresh basil for this. Now that I have these nice little ribbons of basil, I'll add those straight into my tomatoes, and I'll move on to my garlic. You can use a clove or two of garlic depending on how big these are. This is a fairly big clove. I'm just gonna pop the skin off of it. And then you can either finely mince this, or I'm gonna put it straight into a garlic press and add that right into my tomato and basil. Finally, I'll give this a nice little sprinkle of salt, not too much, and I'll give this a little mix and let that sit for just a few minutes before I start assembling my sandwiches. Now this last part is optional, but I think it sounds really good to make a little Parmesan crust on the outside of my grilled cheese. So I'm going to grate up a decent amount of fresh Parmesan, just enough that I could coat both sides of 4 slices of bread. Now we can start assembling our sandwiches. I'm going to start off with 2 pieces of a fairly hearty bread. This is a sourdough bread. You just want to use something that's going to hold up to having some soggier ingredients in there. You don't want the sandwich to just fall apart. So to start, I'm going to add in a few slices of mozzarella cheese. This is fresh mozzarella. I'm going to add in 2 slices on the bottom, and then a nice couple scoops of my bruschetta mixture. Try not to put too much of the liquid in there. And then I'm going to top that with a couple more slices of the mozzarella, and I'll just kind of tear this a little bit to get a little bit of a better coverage over the bruschetta so everything kind of sticks together. Give that a good press, and then I'm going to add on a little bit of butter. So put that right over the top. And then we're going to make the Parmesan crust, and it should be super easy. I'm just going to sprinkle some Parmesan right over that layer of butter and then press it in. That should stick really nice. I'll flip it over and repeat it on the other side. I have my pan preheated to about medium. You don't want this to brown too fast before the cheese has time to melt. I'm going to get started on my second sandwich and let this cook for a few minutes on the first side. The second sandwich is ready, so I'm gonna pop that in the pan and check on the status of the first one. These are looking really good. You can see the cheese on that first sandwich is starting to melt. Now, the Parmesan that we grated onto the top, that might initially stick to the pan just a little bit, but it's going to start to release once it starts to become crusty. So just give that a few minutes and we'll be ready to flip these over. All right, I think this first sandwich is ready to be flipped. Whew, that is looking good, nice and crusty on the outside. Flip that over. These are looking good. These are looking fantastic. They're starting to get super melty and a little crusty on both sides, so I think it's time to pull these off of the pan. All right, let's give these a slice and see how they turned out. Just cut these right in half. And that looks like a really good bruschetta grilled cheese. The cheese is nice and melty in there. We have that layer of bruschetta in the middle. This is looking good. All right, this looks good. It smells amazing. It has such a nice Parmesan crust. I think that was a really good call. So let's give this a taste and see how it came out. This is really good. This is 100% my new favorite way to make grilled cheese. It's so good. If you're a fan of bruschetta, you're going to really love this. And I would definitely recommend making it with the Parmesan crust. Kind of just adds that extra layer to the bread to keep this sandwich from getting soggy, because the tomatoes, especially if you're using fresh tomatoes, are going to be super juicy. So you have to use some good bread. And if you add that Parmesan crust, it's just gonna make it even better and keep the sandwich nice and crispy. I would definitely recommend making this. And if you have fresh tomatoes in your garden, it's gonna be a great way to use them up. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, don't forget to hit subscribe and the bell icon so you can get notified every time I post. As always, you can find the full recipe to this down in the description box below, along with links to all my social media pages so you can follow along for more cooking content. Hope to see you back here next time.